Go ahead.
I'm Harry Nelson, and at this particular time, I'm 95 years old, going on 96, and my health is pretty good at this stage, I would say, compared to what I've seen of other people at age 95. And so I am very alert to many things around. I know what's going on in the world. I listen to TV. I listen to music on the radio and on the Bose machine that I have. I enjoy music, although I'm not a musician, as many of you who may be listening to this report know. But I do like to listen to music. It's soothing, it's uplifting, especially if you like certain kind of music. And I like the old hymns real well, because I've been used to hearing them and singing them throughout much of my life. That's a little introduction. You want me to go?
Yep.
I'd like to start by saying the first thing I can remember, and it's a very faint memory, and that was when I was about 4 years old. I attended a funeral. It was of a man who owned a grocery store near a railroad station in Friesland. This is where I grew up, in Friesland. Friesland is almost gone from the map. There are some private homes that are left, but there used to be a schoolhouse, there was a church, 2 filling stations, and 2 grocery stores, and a depot at Friesland. And these are all gone now. Furthermore, the funeral was in a private home of the man who owned one of the grocery stores. He was killed on the railroad, I understand, and my parents attended a wake. And I didn't know what was going on, but I could tell people were in sorrow, weeping over the loss of this man. And that's the first I can remember of anything from the standpoint of what I can recall in early life before school. I went to a school in Friesland for 8 years, and that school was a large 2-room school. It was built by brick. It's still there. It was built in 1915. Now it is a private home. But when we were there, there were 2 rooms, 2 teachers. And the first room was from first grade until 4th grade. The second room was from 5th grade to 8th grade. And the teachers stayed in a private home. And they brought their lunch from the private home for the noon meal. We all had to bring our own lunch, sandwiches and whatever our mothers prepared for us. Then later on there was one room that was called the ladies' room, and the other was called the men's room. The ladies' room was training children how to sew and how to cook. Think of that in the grade school, in the country school. And the second room was teaching boys how to pound nails, how to saw wood, and how to build birdhouses, and something else that boys could possibly learn to do. And then we had special restrooms, one for the girls and one for the boys. We had running water. We had steam heat. We had a full-time janitor who took care of the place. He was there every day, and we burned coal and wood in the furnace. We had indoor plumbing all the way through. We never needed to go outside until it was time to be released, except in the spring and fall when the weather was nice. I can remember another occasion in school. We had fist fights and we had all kinds of different things, because when you're that young, you kind of protect your territory a little bit more. They called me Ozzy at that time because my folks had come from Sweden, and they named us boys after a Swedish name rather than an American name. So I was Oscar Harry, but they called me Ozzy, and I didn't like to be called Ozzy, so I changed my name from, I asked my parents if this was okay, if I could be called Harry Oscar instead. So I don't go by Oscar, I just go by Harry O. And I've done that for all of my years since I was in grade school. We had swings outside that we used for recreation. We had a baseball park that we could play baseball, softball, whatever we wanted. We had a lot of activities that way. We had a gymnasium in the school building where we could have Christmas programs for our parents, and then the other activities that were important for the teachers in the school, kids and their parents. So this gymnasium would seat, I guess, probably 40 people at the most. But and then how we came to school, spring and fall we would walk. I walked a mile to school and home in the spring and fall. It was 1 mile. But during the winter, we had school buses. There were enclosed buses. We had 4 of them, one in each direction, pulled by a team of horses and a driver. And one episode I remember was in the spring of the year. The snow had been melting for quite a while. And we met a car on the road with the team of horses. And the car had a kind of a loud exhaust system on it, evidently. And the horses started to run real fast. In fact, they became to the stage where there was a runaway. And the wagon was swinging from one side to the other. Finally, we tipped over into a ditch full of water. So the bus started to fill with water, and everybody was crying, and the kids, but we all got out okay. We got wet, however, but we were mourning, and some of the kids, like I said, the girls were crying. And then we had to walk home. The horses got loose and ran away. So the farmer who had the horses had to find them somewhere. And the bus got lifted out of there in time. But we had to walk to school for the rest of the day that morning. But they got the bus back in shape, and it was used again after that. And then we had hot lunch. We had milk and cocoa. And we had to bring that from home, unpasteurized, of course. And we had one boy who was the only boy that the family had. And he was supposed to bring milk one day to school for hot milk or cocoa. And he put it in gallon pails, 1 gallon tin cans, yeah. And the bus was slowing down on the hill, so the driver of the bus kind of slapped the horses with his lines, and the horses started to go fast. And the cans of milk were sitting near the door in the back, and the door flapped open, and the cans rolled down the highway. And 2 gallons of milk rolled down the highway, and we didn't have any cocoa that day. I can remember that. And then I have to say, for discipline in school, if we did something wrong, the teacher would call us up to the front of the room, and she had a ruler, and she would slap our hands. And that was a discipline we got if we had done something wrong to some other student or said something wrong to the teacher. And sometimes the teacher would send a note home with the kid, and don't you open that envelope, just give it to your parents. And then there was a note saying what we had done to the teacher, and then we got a licking at home on top of it. So that was a little bit of the experience in growing up. Well, then I went to high school in Sandstone, Minnesota, which is about 5 miles northeast of where I lived. And I had to walk a mile to catch the bus early when it was in the fall and in the spring. During the winter, we had a motorized bus and the bus driver. And I can remember we had some degrees of 40 below in the morning. I had to walk a 1/4 mile to meet the bus. And then the bus was heated, so that was comfortable. But when we walked to meet the bus, we didn't have any heat at that time. So I did a lot of walking to school, both in high school and also in my grade school time. But the first week or 2 in high school, the kids who came from country schools to go to high school in Sandstone had to meet up with the kids who grew up in town. And that was what you call a kind of discretionary situation. It'd be almost like a red and green, you know. So I got in a fight with a guy from the school who grew up in the Sandstone school system, in the grade school to high school. But he was starting high school like I was, same grade. But I was a farm kid and he was a country, or he was a town kid. And we get into a fist fight. You know, at that time I wore a suit to school, a regular suit to school. We did way back then in 1923, I think. No, wait a minute, 1929. I graduated my school in 36, so it must have been 1929. I was there 4 years. Well, anyway, teacher came out and separated us and said, "Don't you guys get in a fight again." Well, I took courses in high school, one in agriculture for 2 years, as if I was going to be a farmer. I also took typing and shorthand, thinking I might be someday using it. I didn't know why, but I thought that was an easy course. I didn't take language. Some took French or Latin, but I didn't take any language courses. So that was the basics. I took the basic high school curriculum otherwise. Graduated in 1936 from high school. And we had formalities. My folks bought me a brand new suit for that. We had baccalaureate in the theater. We had baccalaureate services too. And we had a pastor from the Congregational church who gave the address. I was not valedictorian or salutatorian, primarily because I didn't have any brains, but primarily because my folks living on a farm, Dad was crippled with some arthritis in his legs, so he had us boys do a lot of work. And back then on the farms there was a lot of exchange help. Neighbors would exchange help with other neighbors, like picking potatoes, threshing in threshing time. And so I stayed out of school a lot in the fall because we had to pick potatoes at home, then pick potatoes for neighbors. So I was out of school for sometimes 2 weeks because I had to do work at home. So I didn't do very well in high school. But I got by. I passed high school anyway in time because Dad began to realize that I needed the schooling too. So I graduated in 36 in the spring. Well, what do we do after that? From there I moved on into what we called adult life, somewhat. And I didn't know what I was going to do. My brother, just younger than me, we were 5 boys in our family. I'm the oldest. And then there's a fellow by the name of Reiner. His name was Ragnar, that's the Swedish name. They called him Ragnar, but he didn't like that name, so he changed his name to Reiner. So that's what he went by for most of his life. And then there was Werner. He was in the middle. And the next son or next brother was Norman, and my youngest brother was Carl. And we're 10 years from the oldest to the youngest, 10 years within the framework of the births of all of my brothers. No girls in the family. Well, anyway, my other brother, next younger to me, was only 14 months between us. And he went to school for 2 years and dropped out because he would rather fix a tractor and do mechanical work than he would read books. So he dropped out of school. He only had 2 years of high school. But he became a terrific mechanic. That guy could tear a tractor engine down or an engine in any automobile, put it all together and run fine. All without any education in mechanics at all. but he did take a training later on. He passed the grade by 98%, diesel mechanic. So that's the difference between he and I. I was more oratorical and he was more mechanical. Well, anyway, that was high school. So we went swimming in the spring after it warmed up a little bit in Kettle River. I learned to swim while I was in high school. I pedaled a bicycle, my brother and I, who was just younger than me, we pedaled a bicycle from the farm to Grindstone Lake, where a teacher by the name of Dorothy Dempsey was our teacher. Her dad was a guard, owned a garage in Hinckley and sold Chevrolet cars. But she was a teacher in water sports. So I learned to swim through a lady by the name of Dorothy Dempsey, and I swam from Jameson's Resort to where the Bible camp is now located. The water was cold, but we didn't mind it. We learned to swim. Then later I learned how to dive, and then when I went to school in Minneapolis, later I learned water safety, so I took water safety. So I learned to rescue people from drowning. So I became a lifeguard for many camps for a while, just after high school, and while I was in Bible school as well. Well, that's another story. Then we went into, after that we went to trucking. And how I started trucking, one day my dad sat down with us boys. He said, I got an offer that I'm going to give you. You can take it or leave it. I'm going to give you 2 acres, and Dad owned 200 acres at that time for farming. So there was a lot of farm work that we did. We did a lot of hand work by pitchfork and shovel. But anyway, he offered us a situation that we had never heard of from anybody before. He says, I'm going to give you 2 acres out there. I'm not going to give it to you except you can put any kind of a crop on that you want. And what crop you put on there, whatever you sell it for, you can keep the money. And you can use the farm machinery we have, which you're familiar with anyway. The tractor and the machinery, the plow and the discs and all that. You can use that. You can use all the farm machinery to get the field ready for whatever crop you want to put on there. Well, in those years, there was something that was quite popular in stores and in restaurants, and that was rutabagas. And so Dad suggested that too. Maybe he says, you want to plant rutabagas out there. Well, it was high ground, sandy ground, and that's the best ground for rutabagas. So we planted the 2 acres into rutabagas. And they produced the nicest rutabagas. We hoed them and cultivated them, took good care of it. And we did the farm work for Dad as well because he was kind of crippled up. So we cut hay, we put up hay for Dad and so on. So we were on the farm farming during that time. So we put up a lot of hay. I shoveled a lot of manure out of the barn during the winter. And then this spring when we loaded on the spreader to spread it. And my brother drove a team of 4 horses on the spreader because it took a lot of spreading to get rid of that on the field because he didn't want to pitch it on the, that was another job we didn't want. But anyway, we harvested the rutabagas in the fall. Dad had 10 acres of potatoes. There were trucking people who came around to different farmers and asked if they could buy their potatoes or their rutabagas. So we sold the rutabagas to a farmer. Not to a farmer, but to a trucker who was there. There were about 4 truckers competing with one another at that time in our area. And we got a good crop, and we sold it for a good money-wise. And so what we did that year, we bought a car, a 27 Chevrolet sedan, a used one from a neighbor for $75. Had a shift in it, and the clutch, brakes, and so on. My dad only drove a Model T. By the way, we did buy a Model T new in 1924. My dad bought a brand new Model T Ford in 1924 for $450. And it had side curtains and had a windshield. You sat over here and you had 3 pedals. One was for the brakes, and the other one was for a clutch, and the other one was for putting it in gear. And then you could let them off, and then then there was a handbrake over here for emergency. That was the first car I learned to drive when I was in high school. But now we had a sedan that had a transmission and a shift in it. So we learned to drive, and Dad never learned to drive that car. So he had to give up driving because the Model T didn't do very well toward the end. There was no odometer unless you didn't know how fast you were going or how many miles you were accumulating on a Model T. Well, then we got smart with that deal on the rutabagas. So the following year we plowed up 5 acres of land in the pasture that was high ground. Dad permitted us to do that. We planted the whole thing in rutabagas. Well, then we had, I forget, I think I was a senior in high school that year, too. And there was a basement that had been built by a fellow who had perished in the Hinckley fire. And I came home from school one day, and here was my brother and a hired man that Dad had throwing rocks out of this basement because they had been filled up with rocks from off the fields. I said, what in the world is going on? Well, they decided to build a root cellar. Oh, well, this was in 1935, I remember. Yeah, 1935. So we built a root cellar and put a whole new roof and a big warehouse on top, and the cellar held about 100 tons of rutabagas or potatoes, whichever way we wanted it. So we stored the rutabagas in there, and then my dad said, why don't you start trucking it on your own instead of selling it to somebody else? Oh yeah, maybe we can try that. Here, I was only about 19, 20 years old, and my brother was 18, 19, somewhere in there, because we're only 14 months apart. So he bought an old 31 Chevrolet truck for us from Hinckley, his Chevrolet dealer. It was a used truck, but we put an old Tasty Bread box on top of that chassis there. That would hold about a half a ton of potatoes or rutabagas. So we sacked rutabagas in 50-pound bags, put them in there, started trucking to places like St. Cloud and towns like New Ulm, all the way to southern Minnesota, because they didn't grow any rutabagas down that way. And so we got rid of it, and the first load I didn't go. My brother and another boy went along. That was his age. They sold the rutabagas. They came back with a new battery in the truck that had worn out, and they had $75 left in their pocket. But at least we got rid of it, and they wanted more rutabagas, these people, because they liked the quality that we had. Well, that year, then we sold rutabagas all winter in that truck, and developed quite a clientele in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So we quit going out in the country or out to these small towns because there was a lot of driving for an older truck. So we started business in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And then in 1939, we went to the Hinckley Corn and Clover Carnival in Hinckley. And there was a guy there who was selling farm machinery by the name of Joe Daler. and he had 3 international trucks sitting on the lot just to show people what he was selling. These international trucks. One was a pickup, and there were 2 other trucks. One was a 10.5 truck, and so we looked at and sat in there, and boy, we sure could use a truck like this, brand new. And finally we talked it over with Dad, and talked it over with the insurance agency, and we talked it over with the bank. You know, we bought that truck. Here I was 22 and he was about 20. And here we're in business already, in trucking business for Rutabagas. And then we started to haul Dad's potatoes. He had 10 acres of potatoes, and we stored them in Dad's basement. I grew up in the basement. I was born in the basement. I forgot to tell you that. Because Dad was a carpenter, but he could only put up. Mother and Dad were born in Minneapolis. I'm not born in Minneapolis. They were born in Sweden and came over here. And then they both settled in time in Minneapolis. Mother was she was a maid in a nice home in Minneapolis, and Dad was a carpenter, was working for a big carpenter company. And so that's how we got acquainted with Minneapolis and St. Paul through them. Well, then Dad, he didn't have the money to loan us, of course, and during the Depression then, it was bad going for everybody. But anyway, we got a loan from the bank. So we're paying a liquidation loan at the rate of $41 and some cents for about 4 years. Every month, $41 went out of our earnings to pay liquidation on the truck. But we put a big box on that truck, a used box from up at Rutledge someplace that Dad bought. And so we mounted that on the chassis. It was a dual wheel truck, a real nice cab, and 6-cylinder engine. And boy, did we truck. We built a real good business. We were selling 2 loads a week. And we built that basement, then we hired 2 other people to prepare the Rutabagas. We finally had our own logo on the sacks, white sacks, 50 pounds, and then we had another, we just sewed them up. Had the ear on each side, and then we'd sew them up. So these were our Rutabagas, Nelson Brothers, Northland Rutabagas. Then we put potatoes in 100-pound bags, and we hauled 2 loads a week. Then we stayed over in a hotel in Minneapolis overnight, and then we spent all day delivering to different stores and restaurants. We sure got rid of a lot of produce, and we made real good money. And then we made real good money and made the last payment on the truck when I was drafted in World War II. So I got paid for it. But my brother was drafted a year earlier, and he went with me. He took care of the truck, mechanic, because he was a mechanic, like I told you. I did all the selling, mostly. Once in a while, if we were hard up on time, he would do some selling too. And so we got rid of all of our Rutabagas and all of Dad's potatoes on our own. Nobody bought anything from us. We got rid of Minneapolis and made money. I trucked in alone for 1 year in the winter, and then my 3rd younger brother went with me just to help me with manual lifting here, lifting sacks and carried in produce different places and basements and so on. And then, of course, the draft came along and got me at the end of the year, so the truck fell into the hands of my 3rd brother. He had to stay home because Dad had nobody else to help him. So he did not get drafted for that reason. I think it was a 4F, they called it. And he got the truck, and he used the truck on the farm. And then I hauled marl for a whole summer when my brother was in the service. Marl is a lime down by Rest City, taken out of a kind of a pit where where seashells had formed over a long period of time. So the color of that was the color of this carpet. And some of it was kind of blackish too, kind of like a peat bog type. And I loaded, goodness, I loaded out of there every day. I drove down there from Hinckley or from Friesland. I drove clear down there every day, got a load and delivered up to Carleton County, Pine County, and here into Kennebec County. Man, I drove a lot of. We put a hoist on that truck later. That's how this way it would raise, this way. And then I didn't have to shovel it off. And then he had a big crane bucket down there that loaded it into the truck. A shovel, you might say, or a crane bucket. You move it and dump it in the truck, so I didn't have to do that, and I didn't have to shovel it. But that truck, it was a good truck. I know how to handle it pretty well on my own. Don't crowd the truck. If you crowd it, then you're going to be in trouble. Just take it easy, let it go in second gear for a long time, and when you're got a good speed, then shove it in the high gear. So we know how to take care of a truck pretty well. And well, there's a lot to be said more about trucking, but I'm going to stop at that point in the trucking business, because that ended it when he got drafted. Then a year later, I got drafted. So now that ends the trucking business. But then during the trucking business, we also bought a brand new Chevrolet out of some of that money. Then I had an aunt that stayed with us who lived in Chicago, who was a maid for a very wealthy home, Pullman Sleeping Car Company. She was their maid in the home, so she was earning good money. She had a lot of money. She would come and stay for a month with my parents. She was single. She never married. It was my dad's sister. So she helped us pay for a brand new 1939 Chevrolet. So we had a brand new truck and a brand new car the same year, 1939. Of course, we were the envy of the community. Nobody around the country was buying new equipment like we were, new trucks. The truck was colored blue and black. The whole cab and so on was all blue, and the fenders were black. That's the way it was new. And, well, anyway. That was the end of trucking. And he got drafted. When he got drafted, he went to where did he go for? He went to Missouri to start with, but he ended up in Australia. He ended up taking care of a light plant for the Army. For the engineering, he was in engineer course. So because of his mechanical ability, he was in charge of all the lighting for a company in Australia, and took care of the lamps and lights and the engines that operated that. Then I was drafted. This goes in now to the segment of military. I was drafted a year later in September of that year. He was drafted in September the year before. I went to Fort Snelling like we all did at that time. And I was in Fort Snelling, I suppose, maybe 4 or 5 days. And what we did there was exercise, and I ate well. He had very good meals in Fort Snelling. And then we did some detail, like fixing cracks in roads and so on. So we were kept busy, but most of us exercised. And we had a lot of what you call calisthenics at that time. And then finally, I went by train from Fort Snelling, and that was was a steam engine train. We went down to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And that's where I got my basic training, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Yeah. And there was a lot of calisthenics too. A lot of exercise, a lot of good food, a lot of tests. And we were able to swim in the Gulf. Every day we went swimming in the Gulf. And Sand Beach, real nice. So we had pretty nice. Well, then we took exams, physical exams, and mostly oral, not oral, but written exams. Then one day we were called out. We stayed in the Vinoy Park Hotel. Yeah, I think it was Fort Lauderdale. Or am I wrong there? Well, I know in the hotel, it was the Vinoy Park Hotel. It was on the west side of Florida. I hope it was the right, but anyway, that's where we were. Stayed in the Vinoy Park Hotel. And then one day we were called out, like I say, out in the parking area. And the captain said to us, I'm going to call off your names here. Some of you are going to go and stand over there, and some of you are going to go and stand over there when I call off your names. Well, he said, the names I call off are all going to go over there. The names I don't call off will be over here. That's the way it ended up. So he called off names and names and names, and my name never got called over here. So I knew I was going to end up over here. He said, you guys are going to California in the infantry. Oh, well, and I avoided the infantry then, because I was not called by the captain to go there. You guys are going to Denver, Colorado in the Air Force. So that's why I ended up in the Air Force. You're going to Buckley Field. Just that's an Air Force field out of Denver. You'll be staying on the field. You'll be training in whatever they want you to train in. Well, I trained in gunnery. I could have trained in mechanics, like engines. I would take care of the engines on airplanes. I was not a mechanic like my brother was. He would have been a good one in airplane mechanics, but I was not. So, but I did like guns, so I volunteered to be a gunner, what they call an armor. He arms an airplane. He arms it with guns and ammunition. That's called an armor. So that's what I became, an armor. So I got trained on cannons. I got trained on 50 caliber machine guns. I got trained on 30 caliber machine guns and some bombs. That was my training for 6 weeks in Denver, in Buckley Field. Lowry Field was for bombers, but I was on Lowry Field. Then we got done with that. We were shipped as a unit to Atlantic City, New Jersey. What did I do there? Overseas training. Walking on the boardwalk every day. Going out in the rifle range, shooting guns at targets with Enfield rifles, when they were Springfield rifles. So we did a lot of training, walking. Boy, I tell you, we put on weight. That's the most I've ever weighed when I left it. I weighed 186 pounds. But from there then, I was there. We went home on a furlough for 2 weeks. Yeah. Then we were shipped back to Atlantic City, all by train. Then from there, I went by train clear out to California. And the train had a cooking car on the train. And we were on a real nice coach. So we slept on the train coach. And then you put on another engine going through the Rocky Mountains. So we had 2 engines on. with a long train with all soldiers going to California. So we had mess kits that we had to eat out of, and so they served us just by putting the food in the mess kit and going and sitting down on a table somewhere, and they had a regular place where you sat down to eat. And so we were scheduled by who we were by certain cars to start to eat at a certain time. Long train ride. I think I was on that train for 2 or 3 days before we got out there to California. Stockton, California, I remember. Well, we were there for probably 2 days, just sitting around doing nothing. And then finally we were asked to get loaded on the ship. And that was on the Lower Line. That was the name of the boat. It was a passenger ship by the Gunner Lines. But they'd stripped the thing of all its niceties and put in bunks in there for soldiers, 5 tiers high. You could sleep on a canvas cot, but it was loaded down with tiers, five high on both sides. That thing would haul thousands of, or hundreds at least, of men beside the sailing crew, the people who were on the crew. Well, we were on the boat for a couple of days. At the time, I didn't know for sure where we were going. We ended up in Hawaii. And I got seasick the first night out, so did everybody else got seasick. So you go out to the railing and get rid of here. And your sailors didn't make fun of us. Oh, you're out feeding fish today, huh? Yeah. Well, that's all it was. You know, you get ribbed for everything you do. But we got there eventually and got on shore. Then you had to get used to walking on shore because you got your sea legs after a while, and your time in which you were seasick was not too long, maybe a day. But then after a day, you got over it. You got your sea legs. One time you get on land, then you were walking on your sea legs on land, and that was hard to get used to. But anyway, we got located in the barracks in Hawaii for just a few days. And I joined up with a couple of guys that we got acquainted on the trip. And so we were out in the pineapple field and picked 2 pineapples, one in each hand, and we had pineapple for dinner, pineapple for supper. I never cared for pineapple again. I ate too much pineapple. Furthermore, we had pineapple for dessert, and every meal I was overseas. Seemed like that was the staple meal for the sailors and sailors, pineapple. Well, anyway, we slept in barracks over there. That was okay. Had a good time. I was only there for a few days, and they said, called my name off one day, and he says, you report over here at a certain time, you're going to an island. Oh. You're assigned to the 46th Fighter Squadron. Oh. So I'm going to be in the Air Force in the Fighter Squadron. Yep. Well, I got on a B-24 bomber out of Hickam Field. And that was converted to a transport plane rather than a bomber. So there were about I suppose about 25, 30 of us on that airplane, sitting like you are on the floor or on bunks, just on the sack or on a duffel bag or something. That's all we had to sleep on. But we left in the evening and we're there in the morning to a place called Canton Island. But I can remember looking out of the window on the way over there in the morning. It was getting daylight. And I saw something that looked like a piece of garbage floating down there on the ocean floor, or on the surface. I said to my partner, I said, looked like a piece of garbage down there. That's Canton Island. That's where you're going. I said, no. I said, not really? Yeah. Sure enough, we landed there. I was there for 11 months. And that's the kind of an airplane up there that you see that we had on that island. It was more or less a training field for pilots. But on the other hand, it was also a guardian station for shipping between California and Australia. So if there was any Japanese planes that would come over, we were there to warn them off or shoot them down. But there was a lot of training the pilots did there. They had targets out in the ocean that they had to fly out to and then shoot at that. And then they had a camera that would take pictures of the target as to how accurate they were with the bullets. Well, that was the hardest plane to work on from the standpoint of armory on it. 250 caliber shot out of the engine up here. Engine sat in back of the pilot. And then there was a drive shaft all the way up here to the hub where the propeller were. And then the propeller, they had an off, what you call a cam that was off center that would activate a trigger wire from there up to the guns up here on both sides. So these were guarded by wires from the lobes on a propeller shaft over here. So the bullets had to go between the propellers when they were flying. So when the bullet came over, make sure that the bullet was passed or coming in. Well, I didn't have any trouble with that, but one guy did. We couldn't figure out how. There was a hole about that big to the hub of the propeller where it was fastened to the airplane. That's only happened once. Otherwise, we spent a lot of time synchronizing the propellers with the guns going off here. And then the barrel, or in the front end of the gun on that one, there was a cannon, a 37 millimeter cannon. Well, I was cannon man later on, when I went to another place. No, I was cannon man there. Yeah, I was cannon man there for a while. I didn't mind being cannon man. In other words, I learned how to take cannons in training. The 37 had a drum about that big, so the ammunition was loaded this way, 30 rounds on there. So each one was pulled off this way. They were loaded or fired individually. Then the canister would move over each time. The boss I had was tech sergeant. He had 3 stripes. He and I couldn't work together. He didn't like me because I was a draftee, and he was an old army man. He'd been in the army for a long time. Well, we didn't get along, so finally I asked him for a change. Could I go to machine guns? Then I had another friend of mine who wanted to go to cannons. So we traded. Worked out real well. So then I took care of the guns up on top. But that meant that I had to do the work of synchronizing these guns too. We took them out on what we called a boarding site, where you elevate the airplane according to how fast or how slow it's going to fly. Then you synchronize these guns too with that. What a headache. But anyway, we did that for much of our time. Well, then one day, what did we do all the spare time out there? There were a lot of seashells, little shells about that big, and there was a lagoon there, saltwater lagoon. And there was a long pier out there. So we would go out there and swim every day. I got as brown as this thing here. I took off top short and just shorts out there because we were right on the equator, hot. But we had a breeze. Most every day was a breeze. So it wasn't too bad, but the sun was hot. Well, anyway, we would pick shells out there. And they were live shells with a little musk in the center. And that would kind of a lip out of there. You could see them, the live musk in there. We would pick a whole bucket full. And then we would put them in the shoebox. I don't know where we got the shoeboxes. But we put them in the shoebox and bury them in the sand out there because the island was pretty sandy all over. And then they would die, and then we just put them under a faucet and wash out the inside. And we made necklaces, real nice necklaces. They were kind of a shell that had different designs. They were designed the same, but they had different colors on here. And I sent home to my parents about 3 or 4 of those necklaces I made while I was on Canton Island. So we made 10 necklaces. We made, what else? Yeah, we went swimming. Oh yeah, and then once in a while a big sea turtle, about that big, would come to the shore and lay its eggs in the shore of the island. And then they would hatch little turtles just and they go out to the ocean. But the cook would go out there probably one night and see a sea turtle out and chop its heads off. And then we would have turtle soup and turtle steaks the next day. And he was a pretty fair cook, I'd say. I didn't care too much for a lot of the food, but he was a tall guy, a regular in the army. He'd been in the army for a long time. But we had a turtle soup, and the turtle soup was good. But the officers, the pilots and so on, they got the steaks because they were up in the higher echelon. And that was part of what we stayed there when we did that. What else did we do? There was only one tree on that island, a coconut tree. So we only saw one tree. And then there was a Japanese airplane, a bomber, had been shot down by somebody early, and that was laying out in the harbor all the while I was there. Nobody was out there to see or look at it, could take pictures of it, and that was all. But it was ruined. It was sitting out there. You can tell the Japanese symbol on there. But that's all. We played ball a little bit. We played tennis. We did a lot of other things. And we lived in barracks. The barracks were not any bigger than here, about this quarters here. Made out of redwood. The planks were about that high. And they were shipped from California out there and put together by Seabees, I suppose. And then for latrine, we had that in there, or did we? I think we had one unit that was a latrine. We call it latrine, where your plumbing took care of itself, you know. So you had to sit outside to do that. No, inside. That's right. That was inside there. When we were on another island, then it was outside. Yeah. But anyway, so we slept there, and then you shaved and washed up outside, where the mirrors were hanging on the outside walls, because it was warm all the time anyway. So you could go outside any time in the night and do what you wanted. So we slept on bunks, regular folding bunks like this, with canvas. And you had a mattress about that thick, was all. And then you slept on that with army blankets and a pillow. That's what we slept on for a whole year there. Went back then from there we left on a Dutch freighter. Oh, that was a hot day. It was muggy that day. It was like the tropics with a 90-degree humidity. And we were on this Dutch freighter, troops, mackerel, all along the equator. We ended at Fiji Island. The Fijis were hot. Thunderstorm came over and rain like everything. It was miserable. And they asked me one day, and I got seasick on that board. And they asked me, come down, you're on KP. You got to come down and help us with the food. I said, no, I'm seasick. I can't. And I didn't. I said, I'll just get worse going down there. Smell of food would be worse. Okay. But anyway, that's the way it went. So I was on that Dutch freighter for a while. And then we ended up on Macon Island near Croix. And that's 2 islands that we had taken from the Japanese. And that island of Croix and Macon looked like somebody had taken a sledgehammer to the whole thing, because we had bombed those places for a long time. There were all coconut trees on there, the palm trees and coconut trees. So we had coconut off of those trees. I was there 6 weeks. And the Japanese bombed us at night, and we bombed them up in the Kwajalein Islands during the day. One night, I know that the sirens would go off when the Japanese were coming, so we could take cover. But they were putting in a telephone line in the sand, because the islands were sand pretty much. And I happened to move my cot out this was near the equator anyways, in the tropics. So I moved my cot out where there was a trench. In case the bombers came over by the Japanese, I could go down in the trench for avoiding any getting killed. Mm-hmm. Sure enough, one night, the siren went off. I left my cot and went down and laid down, and it was about that deep where they buried the cable. So I laid down there with my helmet and gun, and the bombs went off all over the island. I could hear them going off. When I woke up in the morning, here's a piece of shrapnel laying on top of my cot. If I laid there tonight, I wouldn't be here today. Mm-hmm. So I got spared there. But then, after 6 weeks on that island, we boarded a baby carrier. A baby carrier was one who hauled fighter airplanes or light bombers from one place to the other without them flying. They were loaded on the airplane by a crane. And then they were moved by other means on the deck. So I had to climb a ladder way up to the top of the baby carrier. And then we ended up in Hawaii. And then we didn't have any airplanes anymore because they went someplace else. These went to Russia afterwards, I heard. I said they can keep them over there. Well, anyway, we got to Hawaii. And then I was in Hawaii for a year. That was really nice. We had nice bunks. We had nice quarters. We had really nice food. You couldn't ask for nicer quarters. But there I was in armor on the P-38 Lightning fighter. 2 airplane engines on each side. Then they had a fuselage in the center. So you had 2 engines. I didn't have to work on the engines. But I had to take care of the guns out here. So there were 2 guns this way, 2 guns that way, and 6 guns. That I had to pull out the canisters and load the ammunition, 50 caliber. The 50 calibers were about that long, about the size of my finger. So I loaded them all up for combat. But they were more training. They were doing a lot of training. Pilots are doing a lot of training out of Hawaii. So we're there a year. And we went to Honolulu for dinners on Sundays and went to church and everything. It was really nice because we had established ourselves in Hawaii by the time Pearl Harbor was over. Well, anyway, they came when you guys are going to have to get ready. We're leaving. Oh. So we boarded a personnel ship out of Pearl Harbor. We didn't know where we were going. So we got on board ship, and we were on board for, gracious, 3 weeks, I guess. Got seasick all over again. But we got out of ways and kept going. Nobody knew where we were going. We ended up on Iwo Jima. He didn't tell us until we got near there. And then we loaded, first of all, we got off the ship. I think we climbed on ladders, if I remember right, onto a Higgins landing craft. That's one ship that's like this, and then you get to the shore, the front end lowers and you walk right out. That's what they call a Higgins craft. It was named after the guy who invented that type. Well, so we got off on the island, and there was sand. It was crushed like black sand or gravel, like black gravel, most of the island. There was Mount Suribachi up there. Here was the whole island ahead of us. Boy, I didn't know what to think. None of us did. We looked at each other. Iwo Jima. Just been conquered 2 weeks. It just had been conquered by our forces, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marines, 2 weeks before. Huh. Here we are. You mean the aircraft is going to be here? Yeah, evidently. They didn't tell us anything, but the captain who in charge told us you're here. The airplanes won't be here for a while because we got to fill in all the bomb craters that the bombs have been damaging the airfields here. The Japanese had it as a takeoff for their aircraft to bomb our fleet. Well, anyway, what did we do? I slept in the foxhole for 3 weeks. Foxhole is a hole that you just dig yourself. You're down about that deep. You got a canvas over your top so it doesn't rain on you. And you got your rifle on one side and your helmet over here. You try to sleep. Gunfire going on all night because there were 1,000 Japs that were conquered while I was there 9 months. And at night, sometimes the Japanese would come out of their bunkers. They were underground. They had a terrific encampment underground, about 20 feet underground, that had been all quarried years ago. Mount Suribachi was all quarried out. Why, they had guns they could pull out and pull in like this. You could bomb, that was bombed for 90 days. And yet that thing was full of Japanese Mount Suribachi. That's why we had lost so many soldiers on the sailors on board, because there were too many Japs left that we hadn't killed. Well, then we had conquered the island over there, but we hadn't buried all the Japs. A lot of Japs were rotting on the surface. So what did we do there? Not my group, but they gave us big gauntlet gloves. Said, you're going to go over here. I wasn't part of that bunch, but some of my party were. He gave you gloves. I want you to go with this truck. And the driver of the truck would go up to the north end of the island, pick up dead Japs that were bloated from laying there too long. And there were big blue flies about that big flying around all over. You couldn't hardly eat because they were around. And once in a while the smell was terrible if the wind came across that way. Well, anyway, they will pick up about 6 bodies, put them in the dump truck. The truck would come up there and lower the end gate, raise the box this way, and they all slid down the big ravine. Sets a big caterpillar sitting up here, D8 cat. Well, the driver's sitting there waiting for Japs to come in. And then when they all load, he'd just push the dirt right over them with the caterpillar. That's the way the Japs were buried. We got rows and rows of crosses over here where our men were buried, all labeled with a dog tag. I don't know what the Japanese had, but these people were all buried in a great big trench. And so that's war. That's war. And then I had a K ration box till we put up tents. Finally, the ordnance company, not the ordnance, but the Seabees came in and put up tents. So finally we got to sleep in a tent. We had one man who was a cook. And we had cooks. We had a fleet of about 5 who were cooks. We had one guy who would get up 4 o'clock in the morning and cook biscuits or baked biscuits on bread and so on for us. Boy, did we eat well after that. He knew how to cook. And so we got in there and then into tents. But I remember the pilots had one tent in which they slept in. One night the Japanese soldier came along with a whole container full of hand grenades. Threw 2 or 3 of them in the tent, killed all the pilots. So we had to get all new pilots for some of our airplanes. So Iwo Jima was a kickoff for fighter planes to escort the bombers from Saipan and Tinian and Guam. That's where all the big B-29 bombers were stationed. they would fly over Iwo Jima. And when they flew over Iwo Jima, you didn't talk to anybody. You couldn't hear anybody except that noise up there. We didn't have any ear flappers to guard our ears either. So consequently, we just stood there and waited until they got over. When they were done flying, then our planes took off. I had to make sure that plane, that's the P-51 sitting up there. That's the kind I had. And I got made sure that was loaded. The mechanic was sure the engine was ready to fly. The pilot would get in and away he'd go. So we flew escorts from the B-29. We shot down Japanese airplanes, Japanese gun installments in Japan to guard the B-29s. Now the B-29, not all the gay who carried the atomic bomb to Hiroshima flew over Iwo Jima. Well, we never knew it. Then how do we know about it? I was fishing that day off of an old Dutch freighter. No, it wasn't a Dutch freighter. It was an old Russian freighter. I didn't have too much time, but once in a while, in 9 months' time, we gathered here and there. We'd go fishing, get food or get some meat from the kitchen, used for bait. And we never caught much. But I was standing out there when the big megaphone they had sounded off that Nagasaki and Hiroshima had been hit with the atomic bomb. Huh. And they would say that saved us from invading Japan because we were getting ready to invade Japan. But that saved a lot of lives from the Americans because we had lost a lot of lives if we would have invaded the Japanese inland. And so then I flew off of there. In fact, a lot of activity on Iwo Jima. In fact, we would often say every day we got out there in the field, we'd say, never a dull day on Iwo. Their bombers would come in, shot up, land on our runways. And we had 31 airplanes in our squadron. The other squadrons had about the same. And I would say probably 25 of them would take off and be escorts over Japan. Now there's 600 miles between Iwo Jima and the Japanese mainland. So what our fighters would do, they'd put an auxiliary gas tank on what we call the bomber crate. Instead of putting a bomb there, we put an extra fuel tank there. And they would use that up first, flying to Japan. And then when it got empty, they'd switch to the tanks in the wings. And so then they would jettison these here in the ocean, these extra tanks. So that was part of the operation. I flew in the P-51, the P-51 Mustang, one morning after breakfast. That was the first thing you could do. And of course, those pilots, they're trained to do all kinds of maneuvers. I lost my breakfast in the sack. But boy, I'll tell you, those guys really maneuver with that P-51. We were flying this way and that way and rolling over this way in every direction, you know. I'm telling you, they took us for a terrific roll. I'm glad for the trip, but I lost my breakfast. They should have done this between meals somewhere, but that's all right. Well, then when we left there, by the way, they captured over 1,000 Japanese there. To say nothing about those who committed harikiri. And I walked in there, it was amazing, the tunneling. They had the whole army underground. That's why we could never kill them. You couldn't bomb down 20 feet though. And then they would come up at night to steal from our kitchen to keep alive down there. But then we had guards at the kitchen at night too. Sometimes they were killed by a gun. So the Japanese would steal our rations. Well then, when the war came to an end, of course, that's when we got down in the tunnels because there were no Japanese left down there. What was left had been taken out, so. When I'd flown, we could go to Japan if we wanted to what we call the occupation army, but I wanted to go home. I'd been in there almost 4 years, and all of us wanted to go home pretty much. And so we decided to go home. Well, I flew out of there in the B-20, in the B-29, because the B-29s could fly now off of Iwo Jima too, if they were repaired properly.
Mhm.
So then we had the runways in good shape, of course, and they didn't need us anymore, so the whole war was over. And so I was there when when MacArthur signed the peace treaty. It was almost within gunshot of where I was. And then we did go up to Mount Suribachi on the Jeep one day, stood there right there where the flag was raised. So I've been there. It's almost like standing on holy ground.
Mhm.
It's really quite emotional. So I flew out of there in the B-29, and I sat in the navigator's seat. It was a bubble like this, and you could look all the way around. We ran into a thunderstorm before we got to Saipan. And that plane just went through that thunderstorm like it shook a little bit like this, thunder. We could hear the thunder and see the lightning. But boy, that thing was solid. 4-engine unit, and that carried quite a few bombs. And I know when we flew over there on all these bombers, the sky was loaded with B-29s. And noise was so great, we would say to each other, boy, aren't you glad you're not in Japan to get the reception of all this stuff?
Yeah.
But didn't seem to bring anything except when the atomic bombs were dropped. That did it, So then I went back there by B-29. Are you getting tired?
Nope, I'm good.
Then we got loaded from there almost a day later on an escort, on a small ship. It's called an escort vessel. I'm trying to think of the name now. Fighter escort or something. No, can't think of it. There were 6 in the convoy. 3 on this convoy, 3 on this. But we were all together going out. And about 2 days out, we were headed for Hawaii. That's what they told us. We were headed for Hawaii. This was in the Pacific Ocean. We got 2 days out, and we got into a terrible storm. The waves, or I should say I don't know what you call them. There's a name for them. The billows, not the billows, something else. We're a quarter of a mile high. Our boat would go this way and down that way. And they told us, don't go outside, you'll never get back in. If you get on the deck, you're going to go down and get washed over like this. Then when you go up, it's the same way. You're going up, but then when you're going down, the whole waves will go over. There's a name for that. I can't think of it right now. That lasted a whole day. And all the tables in the dining area would go from one side to the other. We couldn't hardly eat a meal. Nobody wanted to because you couldn't hang on to your meal. So we went out food for almost all day. The cooks couldn't prepare anything. It was it comes to the top of my mind, but it doesn't come. Well, anyway, we got back to Hawaii in about 5 or 6 days or so, because we had to put up with this storm, and we had lost the what you call the unit that takes care of the ship gyroscope. The gyroscope had come out of place. That tells you the scope of the ship, and the ups and downs of the ship, keeps it level. And that had gone fairly, I guess, or gone out of whack. So they put that back together again. So a day later, we did join the fleet, the convoy going in. And then we landed in Hawaii, and we were in Hawaii again for a couple of days, because they had to take off all the barnacles they had acquired on all these ships. So they were docked in Hawaii, Honolulu for a while, until they got taken care of. So we were there, had good quarters, we didn't mind it. Stayed on board ship, well, that was elevated high up out of the water, and then you would take a gun and shove all these barnacles. They were, and kill them all that way. Then get back in. Then from there we went back to San Diego on by ship. Another day we got seasick again. So we got back there. Then there was train going back. We got back by train for, I think we were on a train for, I don't know how many, couple of days or more. Ended up in Sparta, Wisconsin. And that's where you got released from your service. And everybody went to Sparta, Wisconsin. You got your discharge there. And then I went from there by train to Minneapolis. And in Minneapolis, we got on a bus headed for Duluth on Highway 61. And I got off down on Highway 61 where my folks lived and walked back with my duffel bag back home. I had to walk a quarter of a mile, no problem. And of course, my folks were there to greet us, a very emotional time. My brother had come back a month earlier from his tour of duty. And then we talked to each other, do you want to go back trucking? No, he wanted to go farming. I said, you do? I said, I want to go in the ministry. Am I overtime?
Nope, you're good.
And I said, I want to go in the ministry. I felt called all the while I've been out of high school that I wanted to go in the ministry. And so I said many times when I was in the foxhole, Lord, if you get me out of here, I'm going to go in the ministry. I never had a doubt in my mind about not going to ministry ever since high school. Well, that's a story in itself too. I'll come to that a little bit later. Then I was home for a while, just to get acclimated to civilian life again. And my brother and I who came home, by then my other brothers were in the service, and they were still in. So we hired out to a guy who was cutting pulp. So we were out there cutting trees, this way, before the chainsaws came to be. The chainsaw was the biggest invention, nicest invention for the loggers that ever could be invented. But anyway, we had what they call the small bow saw, so we cut down a lot of trees and cut them in 4 feet lengths and so on. We got paid for that. What else did I do? Oh, I went carpentering for some guys, one in Blooming Prairie, Minnesota, and another guy that lived east of Sandstone. And the guy from Blooming Prairie said, so you've been in the ministry, you've been in the war. And we'd like to make a carpenter out of you. So I did carpentry. I did a lot of carpentry for him. Do you want to make a carpenter out of him? I said, no. I said, I'll work for you this summer. But I said, I'm going to school to prepare for the ministry in the fall. You won't earn any money going to ministry. I said, I'm not going in the ministry for money. I said, I have a deep call, I guess you'd call it, to go in the ministry. And then the argument. So I worked for him for the summer, drove his truck, did a lot of things for him. Left, went home, went to Northwestern. No, that's just the end of that. Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to start with my preparation for ministry. I had a pastor in Brainerd at the time, what had been my minister in Hinckley. And this is how I got called to the ministry. I was in high school, and we had then what called the Fisherman Club. They had one organization because he was serving the Hinckley Presbyterian Church, and I was in the Friesland Presbyterian Church. But we had youth groups in both of these churches. Once in a while we had a ball game together where we challenged each other in the ball game. But we were high school kids, and it was amazing how many high school kids were around the whole area at that time. So they had a fisherman's club, we had a fisherman's club. And then we had to give a kind of a devotional at each meeting. We met every Wednesday night in the church. And then there was lunch with it, and recreational. Pastor had some recreational deal that we involved in. It was enjoyable. And then one day came my turn to have a devotional. I didn't know what I was going to say. Well, I prepared something, and I got done with that, and I thought, well, that's over with. Well, then I was putting on my coat afterwards, ready to go home. I think we were driving our car at that time. I was driving at that time, yeah, I think so. I felt a tap on my shoulder back here, and I was getting my coat on in the vestibule. Harry, have you ever considered the ministry? Me, a farm kid, pitching hay and manure, loading rutabaga sacks and potatoes? No, I've never considered the ministry. I never got away from it. Then when I was in Hawaii, some of the guys from these churches were in Hawaii in the military and found out that I was there, and I found they were there. One day we were standing in line in Honolulu at a YMCA that was open for service people for dinner. But you had to wait your line. You got a long, long line. It's sort of like staying in the military waiting for your meal. Well, anyway, one day we were standing in line. One of those guys had gotten a letter from the same pastor, now living in Brainerd. In the letter, he shoved that letter in my face like this. I was staying ahead of him a ways. He shoved the letter in my face. Here's a letter from Paul Hendricks. That was the pastor. So I started reading it. Don, I said, you suppose Harry Nelson will go into ministry when he gets out of the service? Couldn't get out of it. While on Iwo Jima, when the war was over, there was something to do. They called Yourselfie Institute, which was a training in college career. If you're thinking about what you wanted to go into after now that the war was over, you're going back to civilian life, what are you thinking about doing? Well, it was the Yourselfie Institute, in which there were captains and majors and guys who had experience as teachers before, maybe in mathematics or whatever. Well, anyway, I signed up for English because that was a weak subject in high school for me because I didn't get it very well. And so I signed up and took English because if I'm doing the ministry, I got to get my English grade. And I knew I'd done 40, so I took that. I got a B plus at the end of that. Well, then the staff at the Northwestern Bible School, by the way, this same pastor was on the staff, was on the board of Northwestern Bible School in Minneapolis, or at St. Paul. So he was out to get students, of course. Harry, you got to go to Northwestern. Well, my folks were happy for me. They were glad. So were my brothers. Well, anyway, when I articulated there, we all had to take an English exam. Grammar, really. Parsing verbs and nouns and so on. So I took the exam. And then she said, I'm going to post on the bulletin board out in the hall those of you who passed the exam. The rest of you will have to take the class from me. Oh. I thought, well, I took the exam out in Iwo Jima. I should have maybe done all right, but I don't know. You never know. So I went over and looked on the board the next day. There was my name. I didn't have to take English. Thank you, Lord. Another sign I'm going to ministry. And you know, I started off that way, and I got assigned to churches all over the place, just as a student. No, I said, no, we want you to go to ministry. We want you to have experience. One guy from Malacca, he was American Sunday School Union guy. Harry, I want you to take on 2 churches up in Mille Lacs, up there in Isle. You do it? Yeah, one at Guacam and one at Cove. They're American Sunday School Union churches. And we don't have anybody to preach there on Sundays. So I started there. And they had a man sitting in one of the pews in Guacam who retired, and he was in his 90s, a retired minister. I mean, he's going to listen to this student. You know, he patted me on the back afterwards, and he took me out for dinner. He was widowed, so he was alone. He made the meal, did a nice job. I visited with him. He gave me a lot of encouragement. So I served there for, oh goodness, quite a few months. Well, then an opening came up in northern Minnesota while I was still in school in Northwestern. This was a Palisade, Split Hand, and Warba. 3 churches, all Presbyterian, but they were small churches in small towns. Harry, we want you to go up there and preach on Sundays. We will make sure you get a good pay for it. I drove clear from Minneapolis, 150 miles up there, wasn't close to that. 3 services. One Saturday night I had a Bible study. Sunday morning I had 2 services. Sunday afternoon 1 service, and then drive back to school. What's the matter with your head, you know? But anyway, that's what I did for about, this was in the spring of the year. I got stuck up there one time in the snowbank. When I got out of there, that was really good. I had a wonderful congregation to serve up there. They took care of me in a wonderful way. Stayed overnight, had my own bedrooms there and everything. Then I ended up there. I still had another year at school left. Then my home churches had a vacancy. The church boards came to me. Can you serve the Hinckley and the Franklin Church? I know it's your home church. You got to preach to your parents. Okay, I've had a little experience now. So I began preaching there. So I was there until I graduated from school over there. While I was at Northwestern in my senior year, a course was offered in chalk drawing. Chalk drawing would be drawing pictures of some Holy Land images during Jesus' period on earth, where he went, you know, like Sea of Galilee, Bethlehem, and whatever, you know, by chalk. And you get a whole, there was everything from black to white, from all the whole spectrum. They were chalk about that thick, about that long, and about that wide. And you could use them, and they use them on a certain kind of manila paper that would take chalk quite easily. And you could draw on there anything you wanted, you know. And so she did a lot of the drawing, the teacher did, to show us how it's done. And she taught us, I think it was a 6-week course. Well, there were about 20 kids that took this course. There was one girl in that class that kind of caught my eye, if you know what I mean. And I looked at her quite often and I thought, well, I don't know. I think I'll ask her for a cup of coffee someday. So I did. We went out. And the more we went out, the more I thought the more of her. And so she was a student too. She was in college and I was in the Bible school department. And finally, then I went on a trip after that with 4 guys, and 5 guys. We were 5 guys clear out to Washington and to Canada on a evangelism trip, where I had a preach every night. We left in June, came back the last of August. We had a night every place we went. And one of the guys, and this was a quartet, the Global Gospel Airs Quartet, they came to me and said, would you be able to furnish a car and preach for us? No, I said, I don't think so. Oh, come on. You got a good car. I had a 41 Oldsmobile sedan. And so, and it was in good condition at that time. Before that, I'd driven an old Buick, a 39 Buick, that I hold the shift lever down to get where I wanted. But anyway, I had this 41 Oldsmobile. It was a nice car. And so the 5 of us went on this trip. Started in June. The first place was Little Falls, Minnesota. The first thing we had to do was buy a tire. It went flat. Then there was all this gasoline. The whole trip was already scheduled by this one guy who had been spending all winter contacting all these pastors out there. Well, anyway, we ended up, the last trip in August coming back, we're out to the island in Canada. What's the island on the west coast? Come on. We were out there for a meeting. It's off the coast of Alaska. No, it isn't either. It's off the coast of Washington. I can't think of it. Well, we were there for one service. We had to go by boat over there. And we had services in Washington, Oregon, Montana, North and South Dakota, Wyoming. And we came back last of August with all new tires on the car, all the expenses paid, each one of us with $200 in our pocket. And all the experience. Me preaching almost every other night. One of the other guys volunteered because he said, that's getting awful hard on you every night. I'd had the same message because I had a different crowd. But I was getting tired of the same thing, and I wasn't myself anymore. So I prepared a whole message then. I would use it once in a while because then I'd use it. And then we stayed for a whole night out in the Black Hills. We stayed in Yellowstone for a whole night just going through Yellowstone. I mean, we had quite a trip. And one of the other guys, his lady friend abandoned him when he was on the trip. He felt real bad. She was a nice gal. She was a redhead from school at Northwestern. So he got the Dear Jane letter from her. Well, then we stayed in a place in Worthington, Minnesota on the way back. Yeah, I think it was Worthington. We were sitting in the car waiting to where we should go for supper, I guess, or something. And the lady walked across, because there were 2 houses, and the girl walked across the lawn with some food to the room where we were supposed to eat. That's the faint way I remember it. And then this girl was a redhead walking across. We said to this Chuck, his name was Chuck, well, there goes old redhead for you. You know, she ended up being his wife. Huh. Real nice gal. Yeah, that was part of it. And with my $200, the gal that I met in a drawing class, I asked her if she would marry me. And by all means, yeah, sure I would. Well, then we drove. Then I gave her a wedding ring for $200. I spent the whole $200. That was quite a bit of money then. I spent the whole thing on a new wedding ring, or engagement ring it was, really. And then we went for a trip from then on the same car, way up to Upper Michigan, because that's where her folks lived. Her name was Jean Smith. And she came from a home that were more Episcopalian, but she had been converted in a little Baptist church, and they had suggested to her to go to Northwestern College because a friend that she knew from Flint, Michigan, where she was working for a party to go to school with. He said, you go to Northwestern because that's where I'm going, and it's a good school. So that's where she went, and that's where we met. So then I went to her home and met her parents. Her father was a fire hydrant for the state of Michigan. So he climbed up a long ladder way up to a fire tower, all spring, summer, and fall. And in the winter he was a game warden. But we made a lot of trips over there. So I was married the first time in Holbrook, Michigan, in a little Baptist church, Holbrook, Michigan. The pastor's name was Harry Craner. And then we had my pastor who came all the way from Croix, Minnesota, by the name of Milton Aarons. So I had two of the pastors do our wedding. And so we drove back on our honeymoon. We went on a honeymoon to Denver, Colorado, in the same car. She didn't have a car. To a buddy of mine that we worked together doing our airplanes together. If I couldn't finish in time, he'd come over and help me finish on those airplanes. And he was spared too. And he got married and lived in Denver. So we were out there, and he took me all over Denver and all over the place on our wedding trip. Came home, and the first church I had then, as a I was just a student then, was in Solon Springs, Wisconsin. There I saw Solon Springs, Gordon, and Minot. Minot. 3 churches afterwards, and 3 of our kids were born while I was in college. I enlisted in college in Wisconsin. This was a part of the University of Wisconsin at Superior. So I drove from Solon Springs. I lived there, took 12 hours of college work, and served 2 churches most of the time. I was ready to graduate and took on the 3rd. 2 services in the morning and 1 church in the afternoon. All 3 kids were born during this period up in Superior. The last time our first daughter was born, I had a service. It was on a Sunday. I had the quartet. Coming back to the quartet, I had the quartet sing in the Hinckley Freeland Church where I was pastoring there, because that was after I came back from the trip. We lived in Solon Springs. I went to college in Superior for 4.5 years because I couldn't carry a full load. Serving 2 churches and carrying 12 hours of college was enough, and then driving 50 miles one way every day. And my wife was a good cook, a good seamster, a good singer. She was a piano player. She was everything a pastor's wife could expect of a wife. I loved her. She was a wonderful, wonderful wife. She was the mother of my 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The 2 boys are the oldest. The 2 girls are the youngest. And then from Solon Springs in Gordon, Wisconsin, finishing my college with a Bachelor of Arts degree because I took Spanish in college. So I graduated midterm. Well, then the denomination wanted me to get seminary. I got my college out of the way, because our denomination wants college and seminary before they ordain you. And so I had I had seminary left to go to, and I debated whether I should go. I could join another denomination without going to any further schooling. But then I had pastors in my own denomination who encouraged me to get my seminary, and then I would be bona fide for anything I wanted to do because I had my ordination. So I went, finished my schooling, and by the way, these churches were wonderful churches, but they were not large, but they paid me once a month. Think of that. I got about $440 a month, and I'm telling you, we stretched that money terribly because my wife was a cook and seamster, so we bought a lot of stuff that we could put together without buying it put together. Well, anyway, I left Solon Springs and moved to Andrew, Iowa. In Andrew, Iowa, I went to seminary in Dubuque, Iowa, driving another 35 miles every day one way. Another small church. But they were glad to have, they always had students going to seminary, so I was no exception to them. So I got my seminary work and going to that church for 3 years. Seminary was 3 years. So I drove back and forth serving this church for 3 years. After I finished there, I went to George, Iowa. From Andrew to George. George was up in northwest corner of Iowa, just below Worthington. Well, then I got ordained in that time because I finished my seminary there at Dubuque Seminary. I lived on campus for most of the time. I went home for weekends to preach and be with my family. Then after graduation there, I got a call to a church, up in George, Iowa. And that was one church out in the country. But they were a good church, wonderful church. Forget the name of that church now. Here goes memory again. But it was a tremendous, all farmers, most all farmers. Well, I grew up on the farm, so I could empathize with them and their needs and what they were talking about. They were low German people, they came from Alsace-Lorraine in Germany. Most of them came from there. Good farmers. They had wonderful crops. They knew how to farm. And they were people who were very inclined toward the church, for Christianity. In fact, I had a church full every Sunday. And then we had an adult Bible study. Almost all of them stayed for Bible study afterwards. So I had to prepare sermon and Bible study there. I stayed there about 5.5 years. I always wanted to get back to Minnesota. Like I say, three of my family were born there. Well, then afterwards I was called, or I had the opportunity to go to a church back in Minnesota. Place out of Brainerd called South Long Lake. And the same pastor who had called me way back when I was in high school, by his letter and by his tap on the shoulder, was still preaching in the Brainerd church. And he said, "Harry, I'm glad you're back in Minnesota." And he had recommended me to go to the South Long Lake Church. It was a country church, but I joined with him in his services in Brainerd because the Brainerd church was quite a large church. It's about 600 membership church. And they built a new church in Brainerd while he was there, huge church. And the church out in the country was a fairly new church too, but it was well attended. A good group. I had some problems there because they wanted to have Bible school. I moved in June. They told me I should have Bible school right away. No, I said I can't. I'm just moving my family. I got to get settled. They took it out on me. Well, anyway, I didn't mind that too much. Shoulders are getting calloused. But anyway, I was there for about 6 years, And then finally another call came to a church in Randall, Minnesota, which was a larger church. And that was in town. So I tried out for that. And we had what we called a Presbyterian executive at the time. And he told me, he said, I think that would be a good move for you. So I moved up there to Randall. Bought my first house because their parsonage was no place for anybody to live. So I rented a house. Then later I bought the house. My first house I bought was in Randall. I was on the country a little ways. It was a nice house. And I liked that congregation. And I started the building program. Over a period of about 3 years, we built a new church on a new location in a very visible area. And the church could be seen from Highway 357, no, 351, right out of 5 miles south of Raynard. I had a really good ministry there all the way through. Well, then things went away. We could live on the lake. The parsonage there was on the lake, South Lawn Lake, So the kids learned to fish, swim, everything on the lake. I did a lot of fishing in South Lawn Lake. Well, anyway, then we moved from there, to Litchfield. The Litchfield church needed a new church. And the executive of our denomination said to me one day, Harry, how would you like to move to Litchfield and build a new church in Litchfield? You just built a new church in Randall. I'm sure you're able to build a new church in Litchfield. Well, I don't know if I want to take on that kind of a pressure again. But I was a bigger congregation, so I consented. So I took the call. They called me down there, and I accepted the call. And I started the building program. Got a long way, but a group of older people who had the stained glass window put in many, many years ago. Felt that God dwelt, I guess, in a stained glass window. They couldn't move it. I said, we can move it. I got it all set up. I got it set up for funding for the church, for the construction program, and for advertising and all this. I got it all set up and structured. We were going real well. Well, these older people met. They just hated my guts for building a new church. So there was fighting a group that were anti-Nelson with a group that were all concerned and happy about building a new church. Well, this was the old group. This were all new people who were young people who had children. Not that we didn't have children here, but we were building a church. I had standing room only in the old congregation here. We needed a new church. And I told them that. Well, anyway, we got the action from Presbyterian denomination in Minneapolis, in our district here, for me to go ahead. So that's how I got started. And we got halfway through, and the executive came to me one day and he said, Harry, I think the pressure's building on you too much. I don't think you should continue any longer. I said, what? Oh, I said, I can overcome. I've had that happen before. No. This is how I moved out to Fergus Falls. I was in my early 60s at the time. The Presbytery was behind me. As the denomination was behind me. But when you get some divided congregation like this, and the people who had the money were the older people, and the young people didn't. I didn't worry about the liquidation program because I knew we'd get it. Furthermore, I started a radio program in Ferguson, in Randall, not Randall, but Litchfield. A letter was sent out from the radio station to all the pastors in town. We have a half hour that's open. If you want to take it, we'll be glad to have you. And that was $15 for a half hour. I talked it over with the board, our church board. Oh, we can't do that. We can't do that. I said, let me do it for 1 month. I said, put it on the docket for 1 month, and we're paying for it out of the church treasury. So I put envelopes in the pew. Radio fund. I didn't have to worry about a radio fund. And I had known enough radio. I was on radio up in Brainerd for 5 years, once a month. So I learned a lot about radio. I and one other pastor, of all the churches in Litchfield, we were the only ones that submitted the request to be on radio. Well, the other guy lasted a month. He had a smaller church. He read what he had, and you could tell when he read it that he was reading it. With no emotion. He lasted a month and he was done. I had enough experience to know you can read something, but I went over it, the message. I knew how much time I had. I had written up. I had the emphasis where I wanted to put it. So I had it all pretty much lined up. I had people coming to church from other places. People never went to church because of the radio program. We had standing room only in that old church. And yet these older people couldn't see it. I had to give up my radio station work. I had to give up the building program, which was going well, just because, well, my executive thought that would be just too much for me. Of course, I was getting in my 60s, and I wasn't all that willing to give up, but I did. And I went to 2 churches out here by Fergus Falls. They were country churches too. But you know, I ended up serving them for 5.5 years. I couldn't have asked for nicer people. And they were beet sugar farmers and also grain farmers. Money was no problem. They raised my salary every year. And when I left there and retired in 1986, I retired out there. They had a big party for my wife and I. One church gave me a gift in an envelope. And the one who gave it to me was a part of a board, the church board. She says, I don't want you to open that check, or she didn't say a check. I don't want you to open that envelope till you get home. Well, after the whole party, both churches had gotten together. For one church, I got a new electric motor for my outboard motor, new electric start motor, so I could trail with it. They gave that to me, one church is out there, because he knew I was a fisherman. The other church gave me this envelope. On the way home, my wife said, I can't wait to get home. What's in that envelope? So we pulled over on the side road. She opened the envelope. Here was the letter. Here was the check. The check was for $1,000. Excuse me. We couldn't believe it. The letter said, I know you always want to go to Sweden, visit your relatives. We hope this will help you accomplish your dream. So in 1987, we went to Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. I had saved some money from the military, which I didn't need, so I drew all that out, plus $1,000. We paid for the whole trip. wonderful trip. Met my cousins over there, stayed in the same room where my grandparents had lived and died. They got acquainted with it. They took me all over Sweden. I visited the Husqvarna works. Visited the place where the two automobiles were built. Went on to Ireland. That's another island off of Sweden. We went all over. We went to Denmark. I went to Norway. Went out to the fjords. But that's everything better. And now I'm serving still. I served in interim after I retired, Foley, Minnesota, for 6 months. I served another interim for 13 months down there, Mankato, called Cambria, for 13 months. I served Mora twice as an interim, once for 6 months, another for a whole year, here, Mora. And then when my first wife passed away in 1990 of breast cancer that got in the bone marrow, terrible thing. And then she passed in 1990. My second wife's husband died in 1990, just before my wife passed away. He died in April, my wife died in July. So she was organist of our church. She and her husband been going to Florida off and on during the winter months, all during the 90s. But he died on the way home. I had his funeral because I was interim pastor at the time. And, pardon me. Anyway, then I asked her one day when we went out, well, somebody put a bug in my ear.
Yes,
Yeah.
there you go.
I'm trying to think where I left off.
The funeral.
Hmm?
Your second wife's husband's funeral.
Oh, yeah, I did his husband's, yeah, her husband's funeral. And I usually would visit the dear ones after a while, about a week later, to see how they were doing of my congregation. So I went to see her, and she was crying, yet missing her husband. They've been married for 61 years. Had a family of 4 children, all adults, of course. But I would check with her when I was interim here, about when she was playing the organ. How was the bulletin? Any changes, between pastor and organist? Well, then we had some friends, mutual friends, who went to Florida with her, and from Hinckley, from here. They knew both of us. So one of the guys asked me one day, "Have you taken Alice out for coffee lately?" No, I said, I don't take people out for coffee. Not that I don't mind coffee, but I said it's just my style. I'm not a coffee drinker particularly. Well, she's pretty lonesome, this guy said. Well, I was too, because my wife had passed away that July. And I was alone. She was alone. She was living here, and I was living up there in Iowa on Lakes Lake. And my wife passed away in a very agonizing death. That's beside the point. But anyway, so finally I took her out for coffee one day, and we had a good talked about our families. 2 weeks later, she invited me up for dinner over at her house. I took her out for a trip to show her up in Iowa where we lived, about 26-mile trip up there, and we talked a lot about our lives and where we'd been, and I was quite impressed with her. She was nice looking, and she had her act together real well. Her family were nice. Her son has an insurance agency in town. The others have been doing real work. They're well off, all of her kids really. She had 2 sons and 1 daughter. Well, we were married in the church here, and the pastor who was serving here was a very well educated individual. Graduate from Princeton. He had a law degree. He was a psychologist. He and I pastored together for a while. When he wanted me to be sharing with him in worship. Well, then when we got married, we had him, and then my pastor that married my first wife and I from Crown came down. So I had 2 of us officiate at our wedding. But we had just family. My kids and her kids and grandkids and so on that came. And then he left, and I was asked to be interim here again the second time. That's when we got our present pastor now. But he's doing it on his own. My age, I'm glad I don't have to. So I can sit in the pew, listen to a sermon. I was there yesterday because we have communion first of every Sunday, first of every month rather. And then I offer grace for the meal down here every noon hour. They'd never had that before, and I kind of initiated it. And I talked to the head nurses about, oh my, yes, by all means. And so we checked it through with the big honcho here, Jack Hero. Oh yeah, sure, no problem. And it's going well. I don't have anybody who's complaining about that, so